Do you like treasure? Are you too hipster to play with Prosper Tomebound or Corvold, Vacursed King? Well, right now, God Eternal Bontu only commands 100 decks on EDH Rec. So let's make some artifact tokens in this unique mono-black commander deck. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric. Let's talk about some unconventional commander decks and strategies. But before we get into that, if you want to take part in discussions and make suggestions for the decks and other content that I feature on this channel, check out our new Discord server. See the link in the description for the invite. This is the fastest and easiest way that you can make comments on existing content or recommendations for new content on the channel. I'll also use the Discord server to host Commander games, where I'll primarily be playtesting the decks that I built for this channel. So if you're looking to play some Commander games or discuss unconventional Commander strategies, come check it out. Again, see the link in the description for the invite. But now let's talk about God Eternal Bontu. This is a 5/6 legendary zombie god that costs 3 black. It has Menace, and when it enters the battlefield you may sacrifice any number of other permanents, and then draw that many cards. God Eternal Bontu is also resilient, just like the other 3 God Eternals. When God Eternal Bontu dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library, third from the top. So God Eternal Bontu is all about drawing you cards, sacrificing permanents, and dodging commander attacks, which are all great things. And a typical God Eternal Bontu deck will include all of the things you might expect: creature token generators, recursive creatures, more sacrifice outlets, and typical aristocrat payoffs like the Meat Hook Massacre and Pitiless Plunderer. But what if we build God Eternal Bontu with an artifacts theme instead? In the past year or so, Magic has gotten a lot of new ways to generate artifact tokens, like clues, treasures, blood tokens, and food tokens. All of these tokens can sacrifice themselves for value, or they can be sacrificed to our Commander Bontu for card draw. And we'll get to play with a different set of payoffs than a typical Bontu deck might employ. So let's talk about why you might want to build a God Eternal Bontu with an artifacts theme, starting with our artifact token generators. Now we want lots of artifact tokens, like clues, food, blood, and treasures. We're all about quantity at the expense of quality, because these tokens can be exchanged for card draw with our commander's ETB effect. And there are tons of sources that give you these artifact tokens, either as a single-use effect or repeatedly throughout the game. Some of our single-use effects include Deadly Dispute, which requires that you sacrifice an artifact or creature as an additional cost to cast it, and you draw 2 cards and make a treasure token. You'll have tons of tokens in this deck, so finding an artifact or creature to sacrifice to cast Deadly Dispute won't be hard. And some of the permanents that you can sacrifice to it will even give you value when they go to the graveyard, which we'll talk about later. For 3 mana, Pointed Discussion has you draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, and make a blood token. For the same cost, Foreboding Fruit also has you draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, and if you spent at least 3 black mana on this spell, you'll also get a food token. Vampire's Kiss drains an opponent for 2 life, and you gain 2 life and make 2 blood tokens for only 2 mana. And all of these cards basically draw you an extra card or 2, eventually, when you can cast your commander and sacrifice the tokens they produce. So Vampire's Kiss can sort of be read as, pay 2 mana to drain an opponent for 2 life, you gain 2 life, and draw 2 cards, which is pretty decent. I'll also use Blood Fountain. This 1 mana artifact makes a blood token when it enters the battlefield. And then you can pay 3 in a black and sacrifice it to return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Of course, if you don't need the graveyard recursion, you can just sacrifice Blood Fountain and its blood token to Bontu's ETB to draw 2 more cards. The Underworld Cookbook lets you tap it and discard a card to make a food token, which kind of gives your whole hand a sort of delayed cycling effect if you sacrifice that food token to Bontu. You can also pay 4 and tap and sacrifice Underworld Cookbook to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. But again, if you don't need that, just sacrifice the Cookbook to Bontu and draw another card. The opportunity cost to include these little 1-mana artifacts is extremely low since your commander can just exchange them for another card. There's Witch's Oven, and this one is perfect with God Eternal Bontu. This 1-mana artifact lets you tap it and sacrifice a creature to make a food token, or 2 food tokens instead if the sacrificed creature had a toughness of 4 or greater. So this is great because you can cast Bontu, and then with its ETB trigger on the stack, you sacrifice Bontu to Witch's Oven. You get 2 food tokens, and then you put Bontu into your library, third from the top. Then you let Bontu's ETB effect resolve. You can sacrifice the 2 food tokens that you just created to draw 2 cards. And if you sacrifice at least 1 other permanent to Bontu's ETB, then you'll draw at least 3 cards, so you'll draw Bontu again that you just put into your library, so you're ready to use your commander again. So Witch's Oven is pretty cool here, and again it's just 1 mana to cast, so if you don't want to use it, maybe you just don't want to sacrifice Bontu because you want your commander to stay on the battlefield for some reason, then you can just sacrifice the oven to Bontu and draw a card. We'll use Forsworn Paladin. This is a 1-mana dork that can pay 1 and a black and tap it to make a treasure token. Dreadhorde Invasion makes a creature token for you on each of your turns, for the most part, and with almost no investment. Now that creature token is not an artifact, but a permanent is still a permanent as far as Bontu is concerned. Of course, if your budget permits, you could upgrade this to Bitter Blossom, which is generally going to be better for you. Now I also really like Glasscast Heart. This is a new one from Crimson Vow Commander. This artifact costs 2 and a black, and you can pay black and 1 life and tap it to make a 1/1 vampire token with a lifelink. Glasscast Heart also has whenever 1 or more vampires you control attack, you make a blood token. So this can make you tokens really reliably. You get 1 vampire token per turn, and once you get to start attacking with those tokens, you'll also make a blood token once per turn. Now Glasscast Heart can also let you pay 2 black and tap it and sacrifice it and 13 blood tokens to drain each opponent for 13 life and you gain 13, but that's kind of like a Planeswalker Ultimate. You'll rarely, if ever, get to activate that ability in this deck. Now we do have some heavier hitting artifact token generators too. The most obvious is Academy Manufactor, which says if you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead you create 1 of each, which is insane. Now, unfortunately, Academy Manufactor was printed before blood tokens came out, so it doesn't work with blood tokens. But we'll still get a lot of value from this card. There's the relatively new Camber the Plunderer. This is a 3/4 vampire with a lifelink, and it has whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you gain 1 life and make a blood token. So this can make a lot of artifact tokens for you, potentially, especially if your opponents are playing with a tokens or aristocrat strategy. But I really like Nadir, Agent of the Duskanel, in this deck anyways. It's a bit expensive at 6 mana, but it has whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on Nadir. And when Nadir leaves the battlefield, you create a number of 1/1 green elf tokens equal to Nadir's power. So whenever you spend your treasure tokens or crack clues or just sacrifice any tokens to Bontu, Nadir will get bigger. And then when Nadir leaves the battlefield, and I really like that this is a leaves the battlefield trigger, not a dies trigger, he'll just refill your board with tokens. Now notably Nadir is making non-artifact creature tokens, so he won't benefit all of our artifact synergies that we'll mention later, but there's so much value here that I think it's worth it to include Nadir in the deck anyways. But we're not just sacrificing tokens in this deck, we have plenty of non-token permanents that will gain value from sacrificing. Now let's talk about those next. Now Bontu likes to sacrifice permanents. They don't have to be tokens, and there are plenty of non-token permanents that will gain value from sacrificing. A Gleaming Barrier and Direfleet Hoarder each make a treasure token when they die, so you can sack them to Bontu, and then the next time you cast your commander, you can sack the treasures they produced for card draw. Or you can just use the treasures for mana, whatever you need. Hangerback Walker is an artifact deck classic. This creature costs XX to cast, and it enters with X +1/+1 counters, but when it dies, you make X 1/1 Thopter tokens. You can also pay 1 and tap Hangerback Walker to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Of course, since we're focused on artifacts, I need to mention Servo Schematic, Mycosynth Wellspring, and Ichor Wellspring. Each of these 2-mana artifacts give you some value on ETB, and when they're put into a graveyard, from the battlefield, so they're great sacrifice fodder for Bontu. A Servo Schematic makes you a 1/1 Servo artifact creature token when it enters the battlefield, or when it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield. Mycosynth Wellspring lets you search your library for a basic land. Ichor Wellspring lets you draw a card. which is pretty cool because you can play your Ichor Wellspring, draw a card, and then cast your commander, and if you just sacrifice your Ichor Wellspring and nothing else, you just draw 2 more cards. Now I'm also using Spine of Ish-Sa in this deck. This is a big, expensive 7-mana artifact, and when it enters the battlefield you get to destroy any target non-land permanent. Now this is an expensive way to answer permanents that black struggles to remove, like artifacts and enchantments. And yes, 7 mana is a lot, but when Spine of Ish-Sa is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you return it to its owner's hand, so you can use it over and over again if you need to. So those are some of our non-token permanents that we love to sacrifice. There are a lot more artifacts in this deck, but before we get to them, let's talk a bit about how we'll use all of these artifacts and tokens to win the game. Now this deck can generate a lot of tokens. Most, but not all of those tokens, are artifact tokens. So we'll use some of the best artifact win conditions available in mono black. For example, Revel in Riches. This 5-mana enchantment gives you a treasure token whenever an opponent's creature dies. It also puts a giant target on your head because at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. So Revel in Riches helps you get tokens to sacrifice to your commander. It ramps you, and it can just win the game. But again, you probably won't want to deploy Revel in Riches unless you're in a position to defend yourself, because if your opponents can't remove it, they'll instead just try to remove you. It also comes as no surprise that we'll use Marionette Master. This is a 6-mana 1/3 with Fabricate 3, so when it enters the battlefield, you'll either get to make 3 1/1 servo tokens, or put 3 +1/+1 counters on Marionette Master. You'll often choose the latter if you can, but at least in this deck there is an argument for making the servo tokens since you can sacrifice them to Bontu to draw cards. Now you'll typically prefer the latter, giving Marionette Master the 3 +1/+1 counters, because Marionette Master also has, whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, a note, of course, this includes tokens, then target player loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. A Marionette Master can absolutely end games with all the artifact tokens you can produce and sacrifice, especially if you let her enter the field with those 3 +1/+1 counters, since then you're draining an opponent for 4 life each time one of your artifacts goes to the graveyard. We'll use Disciple of the Vault, which is a much simpler version of Marionette Master, but with a much lower ceiling. It simply has, whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. Now the good thing about Disciple of the Vault is that it cares about any player's artifacts going to a graveyard, so you can punish your opponents for spending treasure tokens or whatnot, which is situationally pretty effective. Now we'll also use Nadier's Nightblade for a similar effect. This 3-mana 1/3 has, whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Nadier's Nightblade won't typically win games immediately, but it will slowly drain the table and can absolutely win the game if it's left alone for a while. And then finally I'm using Summoning Station. This is a bit of a weird one. This 7-mana artifact can tap to make a 2/2 Pincher creature token. That token is a colorless creature, but not an artifact creature, so just keep that in mind. But whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from play, you get to untap Summoning Station. So for example, let's say you spend 5 treasure tokens, you'll get 5 triggers on the stack to untap Summoning Station. If you tap it in response to each of those triggers, you'll get to make 5 2/2 Pincher tokens. Under the right circumstances, this can absolutely get out of hand and produce a game-winning number of creature tokens. And notice again that this cares about any artifact going to a graveyard from the battlefield, even your opponent's artifacts. So again, if your opponents want to spend their treasure tokens that they get from Prosper or Smothering Tithe or whatnot, you'll be making a 2/2 token for each treasure they spend. I've been really impressed with Summoning Station in this deck. It won't always do a ton of work for you, and the mana cost is high, but it can definitely win games. So those are the deck's primary win conditions. We don't have a ton of them, so we'll use a lot of resource advantage and removal to ensure that we can survive into the late game to deploy those win conditions. Now let's talk about some of those supporting cards next. Now we've covered most of our artifact token generators and sacrifice fodder, but we've got plenty of other synergistic cards in the deck's ramp, card draw, and removal slots. When it comes to card draw, we'll use Idol of Oblivion. This is an obvious fit. This 2-mana artifact gives you cheap extra card draw. Reprocess is basically a single-use copy of our commander. This 4-mana sorcery lets you sacrifice any number of artifacts, creatures, and lands, and then you draw a card for each permanent sacrificed this way. And then there's Aetherworks Marvel, which is just free value. Now, this 4-mana artifact gives you an energy counter whenever a permanent you control is put into a graveyard. And again, yes, that includes all of the tokens that you sacrifice. And then you can tap Aetherworks Marvel and pay 6 energy to look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you can cast a card from among them without paying its mana cost. So Aetherworks Marvel can provide a lot of value for us here. Now we've got synergistic removal in this deck too. A Taste of Death and Necrotic Hex each make all players sacrifice creatures. 3 creatures in the case of Taste of Death, and 6 creatures for each player in the case of Necrotic Hex, which is great for getting around Hexproof and Indestructible, but these spells also make more tokens for us. Taste of Death makes us 3 food tokens, and Necrotic Hex gives us 6 zombie tokens. Now those zombies aren't artifacts, but again, Bontu doesn't really care, even though some of our other payoffs do. So these are great control pieces to help keep the board clean while we set up our value engines. Szat's Will is more sacrifice-based removal. It has 2 modes, and if you control your commander, you get both. You can have each opponent sacrifice a creature they control with the greatest power, or you can exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. I love my incidental graveyard hate. And then you create X01 Thrall tokens, where X is the greatest power among creature cards exiled this way. So Szat's Will does everything we want. It's a bit expensive at 5 mana, but it's an instant, so that's great. It wipes out the biggest creatures, or it gives us more tokens, or again, if we have our commander, it does both. All is Dust is more great removal, which will sweep away most of our opponent's things, and some of ours too, but definitely not all of our things, because we have a lot of colorless artifacts in this deck. And when it comes to mana ramp, of course, we'll use Pitiless Plunderer. Now, our deck isn't solely making creature tokens, so Pitiless Plunderer won't always do a ton of work in our deck, but when it does do work for us, it will do a lot, so it's worth the include. I also like Soldevi Adnate. You can tap this creature and sacrifice a black or artifact creature to add black to your mana pool equal to that creature's mana value. Just like Witch's Oven, Soldevi Adnate lets you sacrifice your commander in response to its own ETB, and you'll get 5 mana to help you keep deploying all those cards you've just drawn. Speaking of sacrifice outlets, our commander can sacrifice permanents for value, but we do have other ways to get value by sacrificing things, or just to sacrifice our commander if we need to. Claws of Gix lets us sacrifice any permanent we want for just 1 mana. And if we don't need to do that, Claws of Gix has a mana cost of 0, just put it into play and sacrifice it to Bontu. Metalwork Colossus is a big dumb blocker that might not cost any mana sometimes, and it lets you sacrifice your artifacts to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Herald of Anguish is a 7 mana 5/5 demon with Improvise, so you can use your artifacts to reduce its casting cost. It makes each opponent discard a card at the beginning of your end step, which is fine, but it also lets you sacrifice your artifacts for 1 and a black each, to give a target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. Now, we mostly want to sacrifice tokens to Bontu, but sometimes we'll sacrifice non-token permanents. So we'll use a little bit of Graveyard Recursion to reuse those sacrificed cards. I've already mentioned Blood Fountain and the Underworld Cookbook, which give us one-time recursion on top of generating artifact tokens. But we'll also use Mirror Retriever and Scrap Trawler. These are great sacrifice targets for Bontu or for any of our other sacrifice outlets to help us get artifacts back out of our graveyard. You can probably also guess that I'm playing my favorite artifact planeswalker. It's Trading Post. Now this thing lets us sacrifice our artifacts or creatures, it draws us cards, it can recur artifacts from the graveyard, and it can even make token fodder for Bontu, and we like almost all of those modes in this deck. Now we'll also play Bag of Devouring. This is another artifact and it costs just a single black mana, and it has whenever you sacrifice another non-token artifact or creature, exile it. You can pay 2 and tap the Bag of Devouring and sacrifice another artifact or creature to draw a card. And lastly, you can pay 3 and tap and sacrifice Bag of Devouring to roll a d10, and then return up to X cards from among the cards exiled with Bag of Devouring to their owner's hand, where X is the result. Now this is a great way to reuse all of your non-token sacrifice fodder, like Mirror Retriever or Ichor Wellspring. Any card you sacrifice while Bag of Holding is on the field will go to exile, but it will hit the graveyard first, so you'll still get death triggers on all of your things. I'm also using Scrap Heap because I like having at least a little bit of incidental life gain in most of my decks. Scrap Heap is a 3-mana artifact that just gives you 1 life whenever an artifact goes to your graveyard from the battlefield. So Scrap Heap turns all of our sacrificed artifacts, again including tokens, into life gain for us for a pretty small investment. And then lastly, Bontu can draw us a bunch of cards all at once, but typically only during our turn. Now I don't want to go to my end step and discard all of those cards, so I'm including several cards that give us no maximum hand size. Of course there's Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel, which are easy to include since they're mana sources. But I'll also use Spellbook and Library of Ling. These artifacts cost just 0 or 1 mana respectively, and they give us no maximum hand size. Yes, they are situational, but if you don't need them, they can be sacrificed to Bontu or Trading Post or Metalwork Colossus or whatever at very little cost, so again the opportunity cost to include these cards in the deck is pretty low. And then finally, I'm using several synergistic lands in this deck that I want to mention here. Westvale Abbey is a great card. It can make creature tokens for us, although it's pretty expensive at effectively 6 mana to do so. We can also sacrifice 5 creatures to it and transform it into Armandal, Profane Prince, which is pretty resilient and threatening. A Treasure Vault can be sacrificed to make us treasure tokens. While this is technically mana disadvantage since you're spending 2 mana for each 1 treasure you make, it can be turned into card draw with Bontu. Phyrexia's Core and High Market are more sacrifice outlets if we need them. Sanctum of Eternity can bounce our commander back to our hand, though only during our turn, so you can very easily reuse it again later. And Buried Ruin and Sequestered Stash can be traded in for artifact recursion if you need it. And that's most of the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. This God Eternal Bontu Artifacts deck has an average mana value of 3.02. This deck cares a lot about both artifacts and tokens. So we have 34 artifacts in the deck, and 28 cards that make tokens of any kind, both artifact and non-artifact tokens. Not counting our commander, we have 7 sources of card advantage, which is kind of low, but Bontu can draw so many cards that I typically don't find that I need much more. And we have 11 sources of ramp. Now I'm not counting the cards that produce incidental treasures like Gleaming Barrier or Revel in Riches. And then we have a respectable amount of removal in this deck with 13 single target removal spells and 5 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $185.59 on TCGplayer.com. So that's God Eternal Bontu with artifacts. I enjoyed playing with this deck during playtesting more than I expected I would. Bontu can draw you a bunch of cards, and with all of your clue and treasure tokens, you've got a lot of additional fuel to help keep your hand filled and keep casting spells. I'm actually kind of surprised that Bontu has so few decks on EDHREC, given how well it draws cards and dodges commander attacks. Overall, this artifact-based God Eternal Bontu deck plays fairly similar to a regular non-artifact aristocrats-based God Eternal Bontu deck, but there are some differences. First, we make fewer creature tokens. That means we're less likely to have chump blockers, but we're also more resilient to creature board wipes or things like Elesh Norn. Now, while we do use some graveyard recursion in this deck, I've also tried to focus a lot on creating tokens through repeatable effects like Summoning Station or Forsworn Paladin. These permanents can keep making tokens for us throughout the game and give us some resilience to graveyard hate, which Black typically struggles against since it uses its graveyard so much. But that is all I've got for today. Let me know what you think about this deck in the comments, or in the new Commander's Beacon Discord server. Again, see the link in the description for the invite. And as always, you can indicate your satisfaction or dissatisfaction with that like button, that dislike button, or of course that subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.